Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mitty Figueredo, and I am Deputy Director of the Montgomery County Parks Department. And I want to welcome you all to our Montgomery County Parks 2020 Virtual Speaker Series. I do have a couple of notes for everybody before we get started. We are taping this presentation so that we can send the link afterwards so that you can peruse it at your leisure. There's also a Q&A box in the top right-hand corner that you should be able to see. And in that Q&A box, once we are taking questions, you will be able to submit questions for the Q&A at the end. And also, if you are seeking credits for APA, please click on the link and fill in your information so we have a record that you attended. So before we get started, I want to give a little information about Montgomery County Parks. We are located in Montgomery County, Maryland. It's a county of over 1 million people, abutting the District of Columbia. We're part of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. It's a bi-county commission, along with the Montgomery County Planning Department and our Prince George's County sister agencies, Prince George's Park and Rec, and Prince George's Planning. We are overseen in each county by a 5-member board, and we are a proud 6-time NRPA National Gold Medal Award winner. We manage and own 37,000 acres of parkland and 424 parks of every type and size located across the county. Like park systems across the county, we've seen during this pandemic what a critical outlet parks are for our residents. And while we had to close indoor facilities for a time and block access to some amenities in response to the pandemic, we kept our parks open to provide safe outdoor space where people could exercise, enjoy nature, and interact socially. So we know how important parks are for the mental and physical well-being of our residents. At the same time, like the rest of the country, we're well aware of the socioeconomic and racial inequities that affect our residents. And like other park systems, we want to ensure that all of them have equal access to the amenities and services we provide. In August, the Trust for Public Land released a report that reveals some sobering data on access to parks and open spaces. Joining us today from the Trust for Public Land to tell us more about this report is Linda Hwang, the Trust Director of Strategy and Innovation. In her role, she's responsible for developing long-term strategy for the Trust for Public Land's research and innovation team, providing high-level leadership and setting performance objectives and goals. She also provides specialized management consulting expertise to improve the performance of the Trust for Public Land, analyzing trends for new market opportunities, directing seed funding for new initiatives, and designing new collaborations with external partners. Before I turn it over to Linda, I'd like to introduce Casey Anderson, Chair of the Montgomery County Planning Board, so he can say a few words.
Thanks, Mitty. I just wanted to highlight some of the work that Montgomery Parks has done over the last few years in connection with equity. About 5 or 6 years ago, we initiated an effort to really get serious about urban parks because as a suburban jurisdiction, our park system really had not developed in a way that was designed to accommodate people living in our downtown areas, people who wanted a different kind of park experience. We had done stewardship really well. We'd done large recreational parks with athletic fields for quite a long time, but we didn't really do urban parks and still honestly have a ways to go in that area. But as part of that exercise in mapping where it was that we had parks in places that were intensively developed with a lot of people, we also put an equity layer on that. And I think that if anybody who's listening is interested in how we carried that exercise out, I think it's could be helpful to what some other jurisdictions are trying to do in really rigorously and objectively evaluating the equity and delivery of park services, to not only compare the socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic makeup of different neighborhoods and their proximity to parks, but also to make sure that a range of park experiences is available, preferably within walking distance, in all parts of our community that are intensively developed. So that means not only the contemplative experiences and access to nature, but also opportunities for social engagement and physical activity that are an important part of the parks provide to our residents. So with that, I will turn it over to Linda, and we're very much looking forward to the insight she can give us and how we can advance further on this project, which will probably never be complete of making our parks more equitable and accessible to everyone.
Great, thank you, Casey, and thank you, Mitty. I really appreciate this invitation. We are thrilled to be able to share this report and just get some of and hear a little bit more about what folks on the phone may also be thinking about and how you all may be starting to address these issues in your park systems. I appreciate very much, Casey, hearing about what you guys have been up to. I think it's fantastic, and I think we always have a lot to learn from each other. So I'm excited to learn more as we get underway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, this report, but let me give you a little bit of context for who we are at the Trust for Public Land. So next slide, please. Well, this is our mission. It's land for people. Here you can see it. Actually, we create parks and protect land for people, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. We believe that nature is critical, and public parks in particular. I think we're all seeing now today, especially in the pandemic, that they are critical public health infrastructure. Next slide, please. Just a word about how we work and why we put so much effort into what we do. We do believe that equity is at the center of everything that we do. We work to make sure that communities thrive based on the work that we're doing. We have a couple of key initiatives that we are now honing in on through our work. We deliver parks. We are also working on trail systems. We convert schoolyards as well, and we protect a lot of land. But again, for everything that we do, we believe that community is at the center. And so we're committed to addressing climate, health, and equity. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. If you go to the next slide, just one more bit on who we are as the Trust for Public Land. We have been working from neighborhood parks to national parks, and we are a 46-year history, a 46-year-old organization. And across all of the places that we've been working in, you all on this phone have probably been to Trust for Public Land Park or one of the pieces of land that we protected. We are especially proud of the fact that we've raised nearly $80 billion in public funds through our conservation finance ballot measures. And for us as well, the 10-minute walk metric is really critical. We know today that 100 million people in the United States do not have 10-minute walk access to a good quality park. And we know that of those, 28 million of those people are kids. And so we feel really proud that throughout all of our work and the partnerships that we've been engaged with, because of our work, 8 million people can now walk to a quality park within 10 minutes of where they live. All right, next slide, please. So I want to give you a little bit of context. So I sit as part of the research and innovation team at the Trust for Public Land, and we are essentially the data backbone for the organization. So we produce, well, we truck in spatial data and data analytics. And so we're a team of GIS analysts, we have a data scientist, a couple of planners, and a couple of conservation economists. And collectively, we are managing a lot of data. TPL has started to develop its own data that I'll talk about in a little bit. We also produce very customized decision support tools that help people pinpoint where to build parks, where to convert schoolyards, and which land to protect. And it was really, and if you go to the next slide here, I can talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today. So one of the premier products for the Trust for Public Land is our annual park score ranking. So this is an analysis of the 100 largest park systems in the United States and how well those park systems are meeting the needs of its citizens. And you can just go to tpl.org/parkscore to learn more about that. If you go to the next slide. We also have a program, we have a national climate team that we work pretty closely with. And within that team, they work on an initiative called Climate Smart Cities. So we've worked with about 14 cities across the United States to build these customized decision support tools that you see on your screen here. This is an example from Denver. And as we were building these tools out, the process of building them out, we work with a technical advisory team, which is basically a collection of stakeholders that tell us what's important for them in that city. So they just start to talk through their priorities, and then we set about the task of getting our hands on all that spatial data. And during the course of developing these tools, we started to include an urban heat island data layer. So you can see here, this is from Denver. And we added this data layer for Denver. We added it in for Los Angeles County. We added it in for the Cleveland tool. And we thought, we are recreating this wheel every single time. And surely there must be a better way to do it. So if you go to the next slide, our data scientist was able to write some code. We have a pretty significant partnership with Descartes Labs. They are a big computing platform, basically, and we're able to pull satellite imagery through the Descartes Labs and translate that. And what we produced was a national data set of urban heat islands, and it covers 14,000 cities and towns. And we actually made this publicly available through the Esri Living Atlas site. And so people can download the data layer, and also there's a mapping application. And so it's been really interesting since we released that, just to see how many people and just the different uses for this information. And the reason that we wanted to do this for 14,000 cities and towns is, if you go to the next slide, one of the products that we maintain is ParkServe. This is one of the largest databases of parks, I think, in the world. It covers, again, every single park in 14,000 cities and towns. And you can type in your city. And if you go to the next slide, what we did, type in your city, and you can see immediately where all the areas of park need are. And then it also breaks down the demographics of those park need areas. So you can see for people who are within a 10-minute walk, people who are not within a 10-minute walk, the demographics, the household income, age as well. But what we did in ParkServe is we included this urban heat island data layer. And so you can see now on the left-hand side of your screen there's a box that you can check, and it turns on the heat island, and it will also optimize the priority areas where you can address urban heat. And so for park agencies that we've been working with, and even those who we can't cover across the 14,000 cities and towns, this is a really nice tool for people to say, well, how can where are the areas that are park need that also overlap with areas of extreme heat? So how can we start to plant trees, bring in urban, green infrastructure to address heat islands? And so this data set has been really, frankly, fascinating for us to really start to play with. And so one of the things that we started to think more about is park quality. I think all of you on the phone or in this webinar who are in the park space understand how critical and challenging it can be to get your hands on good information about the quality of the parks. So at the Trust for Public Land, we know where every single park is, and that's great information. And we know that 100 million people don't have 10-minute walk access to a quality park. But what we don't know is who is using those parks. And what we probably spent a lot more time thinking about is, for people who do live within a 10-minute walk of a park, why are they not going to that park? So we've been really trying to get our heads around and just get more data around park quality and what may be driving usage. So if you could go to the next slide, please. We have this heat island data set that covers the whole country, and we have our parks data set as well. And then all the demographic data that comes as well. And we basically did a huge analysis for the country where we looked at heat, park acreage, population density, race and ethnicity, and household income. And we released our results in this report just a couple months ago called The Heat Is On. So if you go to the next slide. And what we do again is we are always thinking about this 10-minute walk metric. So this is just a quick example of what this, we call this sort of the walk shed around a 10-minute park here that you see in the center. And so that yellow shaded area is the 10-minute walk analysis. And so we run a lot of different statistics on who lives in that area and basically demographics of people who live within the 10-minute walk. And then we're also now starting to look at, everybody outside of the 10-minute walk. But we cross-reference this with heat. And if you go to the next slide, we'll just get to the major findings. As it relates to, I think we set aside heat for a moment here because we were looking at, again, park acreage, population density, household income, and race and ethnicity. And this was pretty revealing to us that when we compared parks that serve majority white neighborhoods and majority non-white neighborhoods, we saw that the parks in majority non-white neighborhoods were half as large, and they served 5 times more people. And if you go to the next slide, we also compared parks that served, we looked at household income and did a comparison that way. And you can see the findings here. The parks in majority low-income neighborhoods are 4 times smaller, and they serve 4 times more people. And so I think for us, we had, I think it was in May or so around our annual park score ranking, we had put out a series of reports called Parks in the Pandemic. And I think, everybody at the time was just I think this has been a critical window this year for people who maybe had never really considered the importance of parks, not just for physical activity, but for mental relief as well, to be able to get outside, get into nature, and feel a little bit of respite from everything that was happening around us. And I think because as all of us were learning about how to be safe outdoors, these findings that potentially you could be in a park that was just going to be a lot more crowded with people just made us really think through, well, what are the implications of that, and how can people stay safe, physically distanced together, or physically distanced from each other in this pandemic. And so I think as we're continuing to explore more aspects of park quality, we're thinking about crowding, the potential for crowding, and the potential for cooling. One of the findings from the report from our data was just that parks can cool up to 6 degrees. The 10-minute walk area can be 6 degrees cooler than areas that are outside a 10-minute walk to a park. Now, that's 6 degrees is a national average. And so when we ran statistics for specific cities, we were seeing differentials of, upward of 20 to 30 degrees in some places, in cities like Denver and Atlanta. And so the report, if you've seen it, or if you haven't yet, you can download it, but it talks a lot about, parks that are what we call deep green. So thick canopy cover, good green vegetation that can help keep the surrounding area cool. And so I live here in the Bay Area in California, and we're just going through, I think it's our 3rd heat wave of the year. And, this is where parks and the cooling effect of parks really becomes pretty critical, especially as more people are kind of really feeling the need to get out and, just find, again, just some respite from everything that's happening today. If you go to the next slide, just want to talk a little bit, just shifting back to the park equity issues. When I've talked about this with other organizations, I think the main questions that we often get are, well, what can we do? Are there any examples of where park systems are starting to address park equity? And maybe not surprising to some, the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board has been really thoughtful and really creative in how they're trying to address park equity. And so they have this criteria system for their capital project spending, and they look specifically at 2 things, park characteristics and community characteristics. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to zoom in really quickly on community characteristics and call out specifically their inclusion of racially concentrated areas of poverty. So this is how the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board is trying to address park equity, not simply by thinking about, how much funding do we have for parks and recreation, which is absolutely important, but which neighborhoods are getting the funding? How are we distributing those park resources? And so for them, they're thinking about different characteristics of parks, but we thought it was really innovative and very creative to include racially concentrated areas of poverty. If you go to the next slide, Just another example coming from the city of Denver. They take a slightly different approach, but very similar, where they kind of zoom out and think about different neighborhoods. And so they developed something called the Denver Neighborhood Equity Index. And if you go to the next slide here, it's composed of a couple different subcategories, if you will. And so this is pretty high level. I think for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to go to the City of Denver page. I think you can just search for the Denver Neighborhood Equity Index and you can see the full methodology behind it. But again, it's a nice holistic way to think about equity at a neighborhood scale, at a city scale, and then thinking about different neighborhoods and what that means for all the different agencies within the City of Denver who are working to, help communities thrive and be healthy. And of course, from the Trust for Public Lands perspective, we really appreciate that the built environment is in there as one of their main subcategories when they think about access to food and access to parks. So I believe that is my last slide. Yeah, thanks. I'll pass to you, Mindy.
Thank you, Linda. That's really interesting. Particularly want to point out how critical that data is that shows how much access to parkland people have depending on the socioeconomic conditions of their neighborhoods. I did want to ask you, I think you touched on this a little bit, but wanted to see if you had some more insights into how to measure how well used some of those parks. You pointed out that in lower income neighborhoods, there is a much higher population density per acreage. Do we know how well used some of these parks are, and how can we measure that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's a little bit of a holy grail for some park systems as well. So when so a couple different things. Some park systems are using counters. So whether that's through a vehicle counter at the entrance to different parks. I know a lot also use a type of trail counter. So it's just it's a piece of hardware device that kind of goes, the entrance to trails, entrance to parks as well. And so some park systems are starting to use those more. I think a lot of you may have noticed at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of anonymized cell phone data that was getting released as well, mobility data. We've been looking into all that data. There are probably 4 main providers of mobility data right now, and there are pros and cons to all of it. And I'm happy to get into all of those details offline with anybody who's interested. I would say you have to really be cautious around how accurate that information is. What we discovered is for some providers, what they consider a park is not really a park. And for some really large parks, where they think where the company puts the centroid of the park might not actually be anywhere near the park. Sometimes, there's sort of computers just picking up like a mailing address, which has nothing to do with where an actual park is located. So, there's a little bit of an error right there. We talked to a handful of park agencies who actually use counters who were comparing their use to some of the anonymized cell phone mobility data that was being released, and it was a little off. So, I think it's a hard thing to do. I think so far the most reliable information we've seen are counters. Certainly people who are, so it's a lot more work, just sort of human powered work to get out there and send folks out to actually do some counting. But we know that we've been part of efforts where people are actually, doing SOPARK analysis, and that's always, a pretty reliable way to get counts as well.
Thanks, Linda. So I want to remind everyone who's listening that you can submit questions in the Q&A box, and we welcome those. We're very interested in what you all have questions you have. I also want to ask you, one of the challenges that we have here in Montgomery County, our county includes areas that are very urban, suburban, and rural. And we find that in our urban areas, where in some cases we have the most need for parks, because those areas are pretty built out, it's a challenge to acquire additional land where we need it most for the kind of parks that people need in cities, which gives them, as you were saying, access to green space and also opportunities to interact socially and to recreate. Do you have strategies, implementation strategies that you recommend to park systems for handling that issue on how to acquire urban parkland?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so acquisition is an option for some cities. I think, as you just pointed out rightly, for many urban areas, it's not an option. There just isn't a lot of opportunity for new acquisition. And also for some park systems, it can be pretty costly, where you're thinking about, from end to end acquisition all the way out to new park creation. What we see as a significant opportunity right now to expand park access is through schoolyards. So many schoolyards in the country today are asphalt, just almost 100% asphalt schoolyards. And so what we do is partner with the school district to put in place what's called a joint use agreement, whereby after school hours that park can be open to the public. And then we work with the school district and then eventually each individual school to actually convert those schoolyards to climate smart parks. So it's a pretty fantastic process, actually working with kids and working with parents and teachers to design that space, because then it's a great way to, especially now, it's an outdoor learning environment as schools are trying to figure out how to get kids together safely, how to educate them safely, and how to make sure that kids are getting that social interaction that we all know that they need. And so the green schoolyards are this tremendous opportunity to address park need, to address outdoor learning all at once, and especially in this pandemic, I think we're seeing that as a significant opportunity area. The second thing I'll mention is that a lot of cities have vacant lots. We've done some analysis with a handful of cities to basically just map all of their vacant lots and talk about where park needs are significant and how some of those vacant lots could be converted to parks. We're also starting to toy with the idea, we've just been looking and running our own analysis on looking at retail spaces. So dead or dying malls and other large retail spaces that have closed down, and those parking lots are just sitting there, and whether that might also be an opportunity to convert that to green space. So acquisition is always an opportunity, I think, and there's good analysis that can be done. Again, just looking at park need and open parcels or parcels that can be acquired. That's certainly an option, but I think right now, given just the importance of being pretty efficient with capital budgets, that converting vacant lots or even schoolyards is really an interesting way to go.
Thank you. So while we're still waiting on some questions from the audience, and I think some are starting to come in, I also want to ask you about the importance of a robust trail network and even just pedestrian and bike accommodations that make that 10-minute walk safer and more comfortable for people. What do you see as the importance of that, and do you all have recommendations on that kind of access?
Let me respond, and then I'm not sure if are you asking about just trail systems and?
Well, a 10-minute walk, it can be more or less difficult for a family. So right. In measuring whether something is really walkable, we look at how safe it is, right? How safe and comfortable. And I know that trails can be an important way of connecting parks, but really just, sidewalks, bike infrastructure. So do you factor that in, and do you make recommendations to cities about incorporating those kinds of facilities so that people have a safe way of getting to their neighborhood park?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is yes. I think we're we're doing a lot of research right now on safety so safe routes to parks. So in some cities where we live, where we know that there has been some violent crime, whether it's personal crime or property crime against people, or against property as well, we are putting in safe routes to parks. So it may be that we're in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. It can be not one of the safest parts of San Francisco. We've actually been working on a couple of different pocket parks in the neighborhood. And what we do then is think about different routes between pocket park, between each park, and then routes between larger residential buildings as well, for people that we know are using those parks. So we're working with a lot of different public health organizations and like safety workforce training organizations as well to map out safe routes. We also have, I think it was at the very beginning of the pandemic, actually, we worked with a couple of cities to look at open or closed streets. And so I think a lot of people were sort of really starting to understand, you know, we just need to get people outside. So let's figure out where we can close some streets down and then just give everybody a lot more space to spread out and walk, and for kids to bike and sort of be biking freely. So we've done some analysis for New York City, actually, in response to Mayor de Blasio's first draft of streets to close, because we realized upon seeing the first draft that a lot of the streets that were being proposed for close were actually pretty close to really large green leafy parks. And we thought, you know, I think if you want to give access to people who don't have easy access, there are a lot of other streets that you could consider closing so that we have some, you know, equity in terms of access. I'd mentioned previously our Climate Smart Cities program. One of the things that we look for there is, so we think about the opportunity for parks to cool, connect, absorb, and protect. And the connect is pretty important, and that's where we get into mobility and alternative modes of transportation. And in some cases, we are definitely thinking about if a city has any public transportation infrastructure that's getting used a lot already. In LA, they're starting to build out this light rail system, same thing in Denver. And so we were trying to really map bike lanes basically to connect to these transit stations, and then also connect to greenways and connect to parks. I think I saw a question somewhere in there around, you know, that gets harder around measuring your 10-minute walk metric, and that's absolutely the case. And I think you guys may be probably thinking quite a lot about that, because once you get into the rural areas, there isn't necessarily an expectation from your park users that they should be able to walk to a park and that's, you know, within 10 minutes. I think there is an expectation that they will drive, and that they will probably drive to a regional park, and it's fine if it's a half an hour or even an hour away. So for rural communities, we've mapped, we did a 60-minute drive time, and then I think we went out in like 30-minute increments from there. So the 10-minute walk metric is useful, but it definitely only gets you so far. And even within cities, we're seeing some of the long linear parks attract users from quite a distance away. So yeah, 10-minute walk is useful, but it doesn't tell you the complete picture for sure.
Thanks, Linda. I'm going to go to some of the questions that are coming in on our live event Q&A. I do have a question from someone about where you get your health data.
Yeah. So far we've been using CDC data, 500 cities data. In some cases, we've also been pulling, the only data that we can see is the 500 cities. It's called BRFIS. Oh, and I can't remember what that acronym stands for right now, but it's the 500 cities, and there was a rumor that the CDC was going to actually expand that beyond 500 cities. So we are eagerly awaiting that. There's also county level data. That's probably the finest resolution that we can get our hands on for the entire country. And that's really it. And really with health, in some cases, again, I mentioned the Climate Smart Cities programs where we're building these customized tools. The cities will have data that they provide us. And so, you know, we will try to get the finest resolution that we can, because we build these tools so that we can go down to the parcel level. I think all of you guys on this call probably understand the importance of making decisions at that scale. And so if there is local data, we will use that first always. Otherwise, we tend to then go up to the CDC and get the data from there.
Thanks, that's helpful. So going back to what you were talking about before, one of your implementation recommendations was for parks departments to work with school systems to utilize some of the space that they have, which in some cases is, asphalt, and make sure that that's available to the community. What is your experience? What have you heard from cities that have implemented this kind of approach? How is that working on the ground?
It's working marvelously, I guess is the short answer. We've converted 220 schoolyards in New York City and the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, or 5 boroughs around Manhattan. Sorry for the New Yorkers on the call. So 220 in New York. We are launching here in California. We're converting 4 in Oakland, and a handful. We're now starting with the LA Unified School District. We have funding to scale that entire program across the state of California. We're converting them in Tacoma, Washington, and in Dallas, Texas, and just starting in the Twin Cities as well, hoping to scale across Minnesota. So, New York has been our, it's well beyond testing grounds for us at more than 200 schools, and it's just been remarkable. Remarkable. There's such population density in New York, and there are so many more people packed into every 1/16 of an acre, that every space that you can convert to a green space is just really important. And we've seen it just grow so successfully over the years. And so at 220, we're still going back and doing a lot more.
Thank you. So going back to some of our listener questions, this is one about asking about your experience working with transportation departments and whether or not they're open to street closures. And I do want to just take a second and put in a plug for Montgomery Parks, because pretty early on in the pandemic, we saw the opportunity to close some of our park roads. We have roads that we control here in Montgomery County, and we began closing them for long weekend periods to give people that additional space for outdoor recreation where they could socially distance. And then we started seeing the county itself look at closing some county-controlled roads. And now the county has actually begun closing a road in downtown Silver Spring that abuts a park that we have, and we are partnering with the county to program that additional space that's basically we're able to kind of incorporate it into the existing park, which is in a very urban area where people are hungry for more space. So here in Montgomery County, we're working together pretty well, but what have you seen in other places?
That's fantastic. I mean, I feel like you guys, that's a model for how you want this to be happening, right? So that the Department of Transportation is thinking about it, and they definitely have their own maps. What you hope is that they're coordinating with you guys so that you can bring in your understanding of where park need areas are, so that they're not just closing random. I mean, I don't think any city is doing things randomly, or I hope not. But, we've seen a handful of places where we thought, well, you're closing these roads that are right next to neighborhoods that already have many green spaces with easy access. And there are all these neighborhoods that don't have any green space anywhere. So if we can't build green space today, to address this urgent need for people to get outside and just be outdoors in nature, let's at least close out those roads so they can be walking. And if they can connect into an existing trail system or connect to a park like what you've described, Midi, that's just fantastic. So I think that is the model that I think, that we definitely advocate for. We're almost agnostic on which agency comes to us first and asks for an analysis. I think we then say, look, hey, transportation agency or planning agency, did you know your parks people can also offer this perspective? And hey, parks people, it would be great to coordinate with the transportation and planning folks because you all could just give access to a lot more people faster.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We think it's been very successful here. Yeah.
That's great.
So going back to measuring equitable park access, I have a question from Doug, and he's asking about whether or not those measurements take into account the access for the handicap population, for people with disabilities.
Great question. Where we have that data, we incorporate it. We don't always have that data spatially. I think that's just the handicap that we have. Yeah, we ask for it, but we might not always get it.
Yeah. So selfishly, I'd like to know whether or not you all look at whether you study large counties like ours, or you just focus more on cities and municipalities. For us, it's a little bit of a challenge because we include a number of municipalities, but we have a lot of unincorporated Montgomery County. And so I don't know how well we fit into the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think for many of you who work in smaller rural areas, it's really hard to get good demographic data. We like to go down to the census block level or even the census tract level, but there are parts of the United States that there are big gray areas for the census and for, I think it's really just the census, because that's where we're pulling our data from ultimately. And so we definitely grapple with how we fill in those gaps. It's not easy. So it's easy for us to look at the 100 largest cities. Every time we do an analysis for the 100 largest cities, we think about how we can expand that to the 14,000 cities and parks serve. But that only covers 85, 90% of the United States. And so, but there are other areas where we are actively working, and we just, it's hard to get our hands on good data. And so in that case, what we do is we really try to partner. So find the local community-based organizations who are working in an area, meet them, get to know them, understand from them the issues that they're looking at, how they've come to understand those issues, those challenges, any data that they have on hand. We've discovered that a lot of these community-based organizations are just using, surveys, and then counting people, they're when they have folks at an event. And so we try to take advantage of any of that sort of hyper-local information where we can, because otherwise we can't get it in these bigger national data sets.
Another question from someone in the Q&A. They're asking, nationally, are we seeing disparities in park usage in majority low-income neighborhoods versus majority high-income neighborhoods? And I would append to that, not just are we seeing disparities in usage, but do people in low-income areas use parks differently than people in high-income areas?
Great question. I can only point to the studies that I've seen where there is research in Los Angeles, I think parts of Denver, Chicago. There's probably a handful more that has shown that park users in low-income communities, or park users who are Black, Latino, Latinx, even Native American, that the reasons or the activities that they participate in at the park are different. So leads you to believe that the reasons they go to different parks are they're seeking different things. So yeah, there are good studies that have done that analysis, and that's all based on SOPARC analysis. And so, SOPARC is an acronym that stands for the System of Observing Play and Recreation. I'm sure I'm missing a C in there, but it's a systematic approach for counting and observing users and their activity in a public park.
Thank you. So let's see. I have a question from Pam Queen here. Would a program like Baltimore City's City Farm program come under the mission of the Trust for Public Lands?
I'm not familiar with the City Farm program. I guess I'm imagining that that's food production in public parks or public spaces. If I'm correct in that guess, yes, we actually have we've worked to help create community gardens in parks where the neighborhoods who we've worked with to design the park have said, we want a community garden in this place. We're working along the LA River right now to put in place a garden, a park that's actually helping to mitigate stormwater. Is actually it's a significant flooding issue every year. But in addition, all of the residents who came out to help us design that park said they really wanted an orchard. So we are working on an urban orchard right in LA, in southern LA, like along the I-70 corridor. I mean, it's crazy, but it's going to be really great. So I think the answer to your question is yes, we would. And but again, we wait to be invited into community by the community, and then we have them tell us what they're looking for in their public parks, and then that's what drives what goes in.
Thanks, Linda. Another question coming in, going back to schoolyards as public space. They're saying it's much more expensive to maintain green space versus asphalt in schoolyards. Are maintenance concerns a factor in these conversions? And I guess I would add to that, like who should be responsible for maintenance? How do school systems and park systems work that out?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I will have a very specific response for you by the end of the calendar year. I was just on a phone call with my California team and two of my economists because we are doing that analysis right now. It is actually not more expensive to maintain green space versus asphalt. And we are going to show why that is and over what period of time. I think what we try to do is capture all of the economic benefits that can come from the schoolyard so that you're not just thinking about maintenance and isolation. So we're also trying to translate economic benefits coming from attendance, for example, because we know anecdotally for the schoolyards that we've been working on that attendance has gone up when there is a green schoolyard in place. And we know, at least in California, and this is where I have a team who can look into all of this, but a lot of school funding comes from attendance. So if you have a kid who's missing 3 days of school, that really starts to affect your funding. And so same thing with air quality, days of hospitalization or not, and then even schoolyard fights and even teacher turnover, staff retention. So we're trying to quantify all of those benefits together so that you can sort of get a complete picture of the costs and benefits of the schoolyard.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'll be looking forward to seeing more about that.
Yeah, all of us are.
All right, I've got another question, and this goes back. We were just talking about taking advantage of schoolyards to incorporate them into sort of our public space realm for communities. Another thing that we look at here in Montgomery County is the availability of privately owned public spaces. And just wondering from one of our listeners, do you consider other public spaces as part of your analysis that aren't necessarily publicly owned?
Yeah, so if the space has public access, then we do include it. My team is going to kill me because I don't know. I should know this right off the top of my head. In our parks database, at Parks Serve, we describe the methodology for what goes in and what we consider a park to be. And so one of the criteria is that it needs to be publicly accessible. So I have to get back to you on that. I feel terrible that I don't just know that off the top of my head.
You've been kind of a champ in answering all these questions like on the fly, and we're jumping from topic to topic. So I think you're doing all right. You're holding up well, Linda. All right, I'm going to take a look.
Gosh, you have a lot of great kind of questions coming in. Let's see, I see one. I'm just reading off of this, Mitty, if that's okay with you, but I see
Yep.
just for folks who are maybe just calling in, there's a question here that says that here in Montgomery County, we have a lot of existing park property, and how can access and equity be improved for existing parkland without creating new parks?
Well, I think the chair mentioned earlier that we have an energized public spaces master plan where we focused on the areas in the county with the highest residential density so that we could, like you were describing, we could measure access to parks and open spaces, not just, actual parkland, but available open spaces for people within a 10-minute walk. And where we found deficiencies, where we measured deficiencies in this park access, the next step is to figure out how to address those deficiencies in access to parks and open spaces. And though, there are a number of tools that are available for us. I mean, obviously outright parks acquisition, making better connections from communities to existing parks, partnerships. There are just a number of ways that we can begin to address some of those shortages in access to park spaces, and we're using data to do that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I know other park systems who are facing the same situation think a lot about programming as well, and really trying to tailor programming for people who live right within a 10-minute walk of the park, or at least for folks that they know are using the park. So trying to survey park users when they get there to ask them what they're looking for in a park, or why is it that they come to this park versus another park. And definitely programming is a significant driver. Language is sometimes, I think, an afterthought for some park systems. If you have populations who speak other languages, it can feel a little alienating if you come to a place and all the signs are in something that you don't understand. So people are trying to think about visual cues, visual wayfinding to help people feel more invited to a park. And then I think also, programming, and we've heard anecdotally, and then I've seen some research that just talks about marketing the parks, just spending a little bit of time telling people that there are parks here. In San Francisco, they used to have like a park mobile that drove around, and it had information about local neighborhood parks, so that for people who, it was like an ice cream truck that drove around, and you can open the doors and sort of see information on local parks and just programming, recreational facilities, amenities that were available that folks just might not have even known were there. I think today, what I've heard from park agencies, or right when the pandemic started, a lot of park folks were telling us how their users were discovering new parks that they never knew existed in their neighborhoods, because they were just, everybody's stuck at home and people were trying to get outside and couldn't go anywhere. And so they were just walking their neighborhoods more and just pleasantly surprised to discover these, green spaces. And so they realized, we need to do a little bit more to just let people know that there are spaces. So, sometimes a little bit of, I think all of us in the parks world take for granted that the people that we are working with in our communities know where every single parks are, because we spend all of our days just looking at them on a map.
That's so true. That's so true. Marketing is so important to this, just getting the information out there. I'm going to take we only have a couple minutes left. I'm going to take sort of my moderator's privilege here. And one thing we haven't touched on is the role of activation and programming, which I think is particularly important in urban parks, where parks are sort of an outlet for people not just to get outside, but to socially engage with each other. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts about the importance of parks activation and programming and the role that plays.
Absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. I mean, I think we don't do much in park programming, but what we try to do is make sure that when we're getting that park designed with the neighborhood, that the park agency that we're working with is right there alongside there with us. And so is part of those community meetings, part of those design workshops that we have, and then is also building and maintaining those relationships with all the other stakeholder groups that we bring in. Because I think for those of us who are working in this park world, we understand that we are adjacent to a lot of other really important systems that are critical to just the well-being of a place, of a community. So really working closely with health-related organizations, transportation-related organizations. People are thinking about climate resilience, education, workforce training, even business development. I mean, I think when we can sort of gather that all of the players in this ecosystem together and help strengthen and maintain the relationship between the park agency and all these different actors, I think that's where you start to see programming really become powerful. And so we can kind of, step back and tiptoe our way back afterwards, because we feel like there's a good conversation that's happening, and they sort of understand that there are unmet needs and just a world of opportunity to really customize programming for people who are using those parks.
That's great. That's a great insight. So I think we're just about ready to wrap up, and I really want to thank you. This was a great conversation. Thanks for coming and sharing your insights with us and with all the folks who joined us on this speaker series. Want to put in a plug. Our next speaker series is going to be on Monday, October 26th at 12:30. We're going to be welcoming staff from the city of San Diego, and they're going to talk about their recent work on their new parks master plan, which incorporates equity and access goals, new park standards that measure recreational value, and citywide park development impact fees. So I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation, and I hope that many of you can join us then. And thanks again, Linda, so much for being here today and for the work that you do.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you guys for doing such good work. It's really inspiring.
Thank you.